Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jamie McCall from PLB. We're delighted Rebecca and the HisFest team have asked us to be involved again this year for an amazing festival and the sponsorship of this event, Medieval Literature from Beowulf to Defoe. PLB is a creative heritage consultancy who's designed and delivered interpretation to engage and enthuse visitors about our shared history. We work with museums, historic houses, galleries, and are currently working at St George's Hall, Guildhall in King's Lynn, the Gherkin Museum in Winchester, and have recently completed a project at All Saints in York, interpreting the stories within probably the finest example of medieval stained glass windows in the country. So on to our next session, and I'm pleased to introduce our host, Dr. Janina Ramirez. She is a lecturer in medieval history based at the University of Oxford. She has worked on a number of documentaries for the BBC, including the critically acclaimed Raiders of the Lost Past series, Saints and Sinners, Britain's Millennium of Monasteries, Illuminations, The Private Lives of Medieval Kings and Chivalry and Betrayal, The 100 Years' War. She has published extensively, including monographs on the private lives of saints, Julian of Norwich, Beowulf, and the instant Sunday Times bestseller, Femina, A New History of the Middle Ages. If you could show your appreciation, please.
Oh. Thank you. That was such a lovely introduction. I am just going to say I have been made a professor, so it's Professor Janina Ramirez. Thank you. There we go. Now that I've shown off about that. Yes, we have a team of professors up here today, and what a wonderful idea for an event, HistFest. I think Rebecca shows such insight when she plans these events and talks, and putting these two brilliant human beings together was a stroke of genius, because we will be covering the globe from east to west in the course of an hour. Hold on to your seats. So please let me introduce our speakers. Professor Heather O'Donoghue is Emeritus Professor at the University of Oxford and an internationally recognised expert in Old Norse, Icelandic and Old English literature. Her work explores the reception of Old Norse literature in post-medieval European culture and the afterlife of Old Norse myth, particularly in its political dimension. Her books, From Asgard to Valhalla, The Remarkable History of Norse Myths, English Poetry and Old Norse Myth, are essential reading for anyone interested in early medieval literature. And you're here to talk about a new book. Can I show them? Okay. Isn't it beautiful? Look. Beowulf, Poem, Poet and Hero. So very excited to hear all about that. But she also writes about crime fiction and has been a judge on the Steel and Gold Dagger Awards. So very good on her crime fiction too. On a personal note, Heather was my undergraduate tutor. So I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for her, genuinely. Such an honour. I'm emotional being here. Professor Michael Wood needs no introduction. Professor of Public History at the University of Manchester. He's brought history to life for students, readers and viewers for over 4 decades. Made well over 100 documentary films, including Art of the Western World, In Search of the Trojan War, In the Footsteps of Alexander the Great, Conquistadors and The Story of India. I mean, that's just a few. All of which were accompanied by best-selling books. He is currently the president of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding, an organisation founded to promote understanding and friendship between British and Chinese people, and has made many documentaries on China. Today, he will be discussing his beautiful book that I've had the pleasure of poring over, In the Footsteps of Defoe. And also on a personal note, I grew up devouring Michael's documentaries on television, and I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for him. Please welcome Michael and Heather. So it is wonderful to be here talking to you. And what at first seems like two very disparate concepts. Beowulf on the one hand, the poetry of Du Fu in China on the other hand. But what we have binding them together, of course, is the timing.
Yes.
The idea that they're both coming out of a similar time period in history, even if they are worlds apart geographically. Now, what I thought we'd do is, Heather, if you wouldn't mind introducing the audience to the world of Beowulf. We've got some slides we can go through.
Lovely.
And then after that, Michael, if you would introduce us to Du Fu, and we'll have some readings as well. But just assume, I think, that you are introducing it for the very first time. Heather O'Donoghue, what is Beowulf?
Right. Okay, well, that's quite a task. Okay, so it's an Anglo-Saxon poem, which means that it was composed or it developed or something, and nobody really knows, during the Anglo-Saxon period, but nobody knows exactly when. So sometime between maybe 700 AD, CE, or, and what about the Norman conquest, but probably earlier than that, 1016. So somewhere in the second half of that millennium. It's a long poem, so it's 3,000 lines long, and there's nothing else like it. From the Anglo-Saxon period. It's not like anything else. And you can see from the first of those, of Nina's slides, that it's not the manuscript. It's written in one manuscript, just one witness of it, and you can see it's a bit crumbly around the edges. That's because in 1731, it was thrown out of a window because where it was being kept in the unbelievably, ironically named Ashburnham House, that, you couldn't make it up. There was a fire. And you can see it's kind of crumbly around the edges. Apparently, the story goes that the librarian in his nightie threw it out of a window, and some boys from the nearby grammar school caught it. Otherwise, there'd be no trace of it whatsoever, because there's no mention of it anywhere ever again until about 1700, when a British antiquarian said that he sent a message around. He was cataloguing old books, and he sent a message around Scandinavian scholars saying, does anybody know anything about this funny poem that I found? He couldn't understand it. So the story of the poem, which he never really kind of understood, and the first editors didn't understand it either, really. The story of the poem is that there's a Danish king called Hrothgar, and Hrothgar had a glorious past as the king of the Danes, but he's now beset by a pair of monsters, a mother and son monsters, kind of humanoid monsters. And a hero from a place in Sweden. If you look also at the second slide there that Nina's got there, you can see that it's all basically happening on the right-hand side of that map. And Beowulf's people are called the Yeats. It looks like Geats, and I think I just say Yeat because that's what people say. So Beowulf comes from Yeatland to help out Hrothgar, and he spoiler alert, he kills the two monsters. And he goes then back to Yeatland, he becomes king, he rules for 50 years, and then his own kingdom, when he's an old man, is beset by a dragon. And again, spoiler alert, he's killed fighting the dragon. What the poem, that does the poem no favours to describe it like that. Because it's not really about fights with monsters, it's about an Anglo-Saxon, a learned scholar's imagining of the Scandinavian past. It's a creation of the imagination. It's full of mystery, but the central one, and the thing that got me interested in it right to begin with, is what on earth was an Anglo-Saxon Christian, a churchman, perhaps a monk, perhaps some other kind of cleric. Why on earth was he writing this long poem about the ancestors of the Vikings, who were, as everybody knows, at any time you care to pinpoint in the Anglo-Saxon period, pillaging, plundering these terrible pagan pirates. Sorry, a lot of alliteration there.
Very old English.
Yes. So the setting of Beowulf is a kind of Scandinavia of the mind. It's a place that's dominated by the sea, and even dry land, paradoxically, is terribly wet. There are waterfalls, there are bottomless pools, one of which the monster and his mother live at the bottom of, yeah. And a marshland and so on. And the poem as a whole is an extraordinary patchwork, a great patchwork, or perhaps better, kaleidoscope of different stories about the past. So that it's full of different voices. So you've got the poet narrator who's managing the whole thing like an MC, you know, and he's telling you stories about how the Danes in times gone by used to love to listen to stories like, and then you get another story. And the characters are recalling the past, describing the past. Beowulf, when he's in his last fight with the dragon, is imagining his childhood, you know, this old man remembering his childhood as he faces his nemesis. And so what you get is this extraordinary, let's say, kaleidoscope, good kings, bad kings, treachery and loyalty, treasure and curses, victories and defeats. I mean, it's just a kind of great sort of interlocking range of different variations on really what it is to live a good life, really. And the stories, this great mass of interlocking stories, come from absolutely all over the place. He was an extraordinarily learned man, the poet. So you can see in some of the stories echoes of Old Norse myth. You can see echoes of Bible stories. There's a lot about Cain, and the Cain and Abel story is the first fratricide. There's Scandinavian legend. There are folk tales, and they're all slightly transformed, slightly tweaked, so that you can see there's a story about a legendary Danish king, and you can see that the story of what happens to him is the story in Norse mythology of a Norse god. So you can see that there's been this kind of transformation. So what you have in the whole poem is a picture of this kind of glittering, dangerous, and doomed world, because it's all about the past. That's what it's about. It's about how this extraordinary glory in this imagined landscape has gone. And the whole thing is kind of held together by a series of reverberating echoes. Things keep happening again. Fire, for instance. You know that in the future of the poem, Hrothgar's great hall, Heorot, there's a kind of imagining of a sort of, I mean, I imagine that the poet even imagined the hall, like that reddish picture there. But Heorot, the great hall, is going to be consumed by fire. The narrator tells us that. The Danes don't know that. That's the great thing about the first half of the poem. The Danes do not know what's coming to them. Some of them fear what's coming to them, but mostly they just don't know what's going to happen. You think at the beginning of the poet is constantly wrong-footing you. So you think at the beginning of the poem, it begins with a very grandiose opening. We've heard of the glory of the Danes and all the brave deeds they did. So how does it open? It opens with Hrothgar, this old defeated king whose glory days are past, who's not angry about the way the monsters are attacking his kingdom, but heartbroken by it, heartbroken by the fact that his country is being ravaged. So the poet kind of puts you wrong like that. And strange things happen in the poem. Water burns, a sword melts, and then how strange is it that a sword should melt? Ice melts after all, and the poet tells us that. So stranger things happen in the real world even than happen in the Beowulf world. And the other thing that holds a lot of things together, this is the cover of my book about Beowulf, and that picture there is a drinking horn. But I don't know if you can see, it almost seems to be sitting up on its kind of front legs. So it's starting to look a little bit organic. And then, heavens, its tail has turned into the head of another beast, which is biting the tail of the dragon. And the dragon is behaving like a human in sipping from the cup. So you can never quite tell whether this object, this man-made object, is is meant to be an animal or an inorganic thing or what. And Beowulf's full of that kind of indeterminacy. My favourite example, a very simple example, is that it's full of compound words when you stick two words together and you make a compound word. So one of my favourites, a very simple one, mist slopes, right? So are mist slopes, are they misty slopes? So are they hills with mist on them? Or are they billows of mist that look like hills? Ooh. Or are they both? And anyway, when Grendel attacks Heorot, he comes out from this kind of indeterminate, shifting kind of landscape. So that's all the sort of strangeness, but with the strangeness, there's an awful lot of quite touching humanity. So there's Hrothgar, as I've said, the old king. He can't sleep. And there's Beowulf, who comes as a kind of model hero, but very tactfully and diplomatically says, if I can help in any way, if it's true what I've heard, that a great king, and so on, he's terribly tactful. When he goes back to his own land, he's pretty shrewd. He says to his lord, there's no future for the Danes, that I've killed the monsters, but the Danes are in trouble. So he's pretty shrewd. And then you've got Hrothgar's presumably much younger wife, who's anxious for the future of her children, given that Hrothgar's nephews are around, kind of, jostling for power. My final point then will be to go back to the monsters, which I kind of dissed at the beginning as not doing the poem any favour if you say it's a poem about monsters. We think about I don't like to allegorize the monsters, but if you think about what the monsters represent, so you've got Grendel, the humanoid monster, young, hot-headed, perhaps understandably resentful of the humans in Heorot, and acting on impulse. And then you've got Grendel's mother, vengeful. Is her vengeance disproportionate? Have you thought about disproportionate reprisals? And then there's the dragon sitting happily on power and wealth until it's provoked. Now, when Seamus Heaney made his celebrated translation of Beowulf, people started to think, there are parallels there with the Troubles. Now, Seamus Heaney never used any of those words like tit-for-tat killing or intermarriage or whatever, sectarian, any of those words. But people couldn't help see. And now you think about present-day warfare, and you think about Ukraine, and you think about Syria, which I've just been hearing about today. You think about Gaza, and you think things like reprisals. It's all happening all over again. And so there's something archetypal about what's happening in Beowulf that you just can't help thinking about present-day warfare and questions like who started it, and are reprisals proportionate, and how can we stop it? So that's my take on Beowulf.
Thank you, Heather. That was amazing. Absolutely honour to listen to you summarise it like that. I do believe you have an extract from Beowulf that you were going to read for us. I've just put up a couple of slides here that illustrate the way that Old English sounds. Yep. And you mentioned there kennings, those sort of words that combine two separate ideas to make something new, and the alliteration, and then the oration, the idea that these may have been performed in these sorts of halls. So having that all in our minds, I think we should listen. Oh, that's a bit of text. Yeah, I think we should listen to some Old English.
Okay, so I'll read that out. As Nina was saying, Old English proceeds in what are called half lines, and that bit of text, it's easier to see the half lines if there's a bigger space. At the moment, you've got two half lines on each line, and there isn't much of a space between them. But I'll make a little bit of a pause just so that you can see. And the first word, I say in my book, rather kind of facetiously, that Beowulf begins with a bang, because what? Who knows what that means? It's cognate with the English word what, W-H-A-T. Maybe it was like a gavel. like that. Who knows? Nobody knows. But
Seamus Heaney starts it with so.
So, which is
very Irish.
It's
sort of
marvellous,
twist
yeah.
on it.
So is marvellous because so suggests the solemnity of the poem without the pomposity.
Absolutely.
There was an Edwardian translator who began, "What ho?"
What ho? What ho?
I mean, which is, it seems risible now. On the other hand, you know, it's kind of what? And Maria Devana Headley, who's an American novelist who's written a Beowulf novel, which is actually rather a clever thing. There are some terrible Beowulf novels, but
and
Devana,
films.
Yes, but Maria Devana Headley's novel is great. She's also translated Beowulf, and she begins, bro.
Ooh.
Because what she wants is that kind of American male kind of brother collectiveness bringing in. I mean, the worry about that is that may soon be unintelligible because it's so much of its time. It's difficult. So anyway, so it begins what, okay, and then we launch into the half lines. What? We Gardena in Jardagum, Theod Kinninger Thrim Jefrunen. Who the Athlingers, Ellen Fremeden. Oft shield chafing, shiathan a threatum, many a maidum meadu settle oft teach, edgesuda airless. Swithan irest werth verschaft funden. He thas frofra je bad, weox under walknum, weoth mindum thach. Hoth that him eichwilk ther sitendra over chronorada hiran shoulder, gomban gilden. That was good kinning.
So good, such a good excerpt. And if you noticed me and Michael reading them on, I think one thing we can all firmly agree on among the three of us sat here is that we're all passionate about this poem.
Yes.
Passionate about Old English, passionate about how it sounds. And I mean, the way you read it there, Heather, was beautiful because I'm sure, I mean, again, just to remind those of you in the audience to whom this is new, Old English is new, this is English. This is what was spoken. Languages are organisms that change and develop across centuries. So this is the vernacular. This is what was spoken among people. And yet, doesn't it sound different and slightly Germanic and alien almost? But you really pulled out there, Heather, the beautiful alliterative patterns on the half line. You know, I've always liked the Verschaft, the Funden, hey, that's Frofrejabad, the and then the m. So this idea, I've always said with Beowulf, it's almost more like rap than anything else because it's
very
rhythmic
rap,
and it's spitting and it's like.
And how would it have been performed, do you think?
Yes.
I mean, we actually had a Beowulf event with Seamus Heaney on this stage some years ago with Benjamin Bagby.
Yes, I've heard Benjamin Bagby.
Who created a lyre, exactly as in your picture.
Yes.
And he didn't exactly sing it, but it was really kind of, what? We Gardena, kind of stuff, He really hit it.
Yeah.
Would it have been sung, declaimed?
I don't know. I think it probably wouldn't have been sung. They tried to reconstruct a lyre from Sutton Hoo, didn't they? And then they decided that was all wrong, and they put it together wrong. And so I don't think it would have been sung, mainly because the poetic texture of it is so dense. I think the main thing is it would have been slow because you really have to think. You really have to think about it. I also feel we've got the kind of Chinese boxes, right? Sorry, we've got the poet, who is a flesh and blood poet, as literary critics say, who is now irrecoverable. We've no idea who he was, and if we had a name, it wouldn't mean anything. See what I mean? It's just, and then you have the narrative voice, which is what we, the kind of consciousness we imagine relaying the poem to us, whether it's on the page or whatever. Then you might have a narrator, and then you've got all the voices I described earlier, kind of in the poem. But the funny thing is, you see, that the poet was, well, as I said, almost certainly a Christian, extremely learned, knows an awful lot of things, has a huge, wide range of reference. So he was not, I think, like the wild bard that somebody imagined on the previous slide, but whoever is reading out, I think it was probably performed orally, I don't think it was composed orally, but whoever was reading it out is kind of taking on the role of that court poet. So I like to imagine that in a monastic refectory, you've got all these monks sitting around, and you have somebody reading, and he begins as if he's a court poet in an early Scandinavian heroic society, and the monks are all kind of imagining themselves in this society. Now, it's not just that I'm imagining that out of nowhere, because an 8th century churchman called Alcuin, who was a visiting scholar at the court of the Emperor Charlemagne in France. He wrote a letter in which he said that the Viking raids were God's punishment, because the Anglo-Saxons had, particularly Anglo-Saxon monks, had let their standards fall. And he said, you know, you like to listen to heroic stories while you're eating your meal instead of listening to readings from the Bible.
What has Ingeld got to do with Christ?
What has Ingeld got to do with Christ, he says. Ingeld is mentioned once in Beowulf as the disastrous marriage of Hrothgar's daughter. So it does seem like it's possible that the audience, which would be, I think, an audience of clerics and probably monks, are sitting there, imagining themselves being addressed by the kind of wild bard that you had, and that the narrator is, and behind him, the poet, are kind of taking on that role.
I like that very much, Helen. I think it kind of comes as a newish but sort of adaptation of the way that people have talked about the performance of Beowulf, because I think traditionally the problem with Beowulf, of course, is that there is so much in there that is no doubt has its oral tradition going back much further. The very subject matter itself is probably hundreds of years before the time it's been preserved in a manuscript.
Possibly,
So it's that relationship between the sort of the embryonic stories, the myths, the characters, and then the finished product. But I like this idea because, again, I mean, this ties into a lot of what we all work on with the early medieval period. Your pre-Benedictine Reformation, monasteries are mini palaces. They're noisy,
rich,
busy, rich, palatial, and they're the crafts workshops and these bustling places. And the people going into them and originally are coming from the kind of nobility and this warrior elite, aren't they?
Yes.
So I like that idea very much, that it's sort of a performance for monks that still have a taste for this heroic culture.
Absolutely.
They're still interested in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not sure we should forget the courtly atmosphere, though, especially pre-Benedictine Reformation. The court is the centre of culture, isn't it? In the great kings, going back to Alfred and all that. And, they had entertainments were required all the time. Weren't they? And they were used to quite sophisticated entertainment, weren't they? There's a passage in the Chronicle of Athelweird, who is a member of the royal family, writing in about 970, and he talks about the translations of Alfred the Great. And he said, of course, he translated a lot of famous books. Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. As anybody will know who has heard the tearful passion of Boethius actually performed. And that's just the moment you get the first musical notations of the metra of the Boethius text in English manuscripts, isn't it? It's about the 9th century is when you get the start of Western notation on the continent, and then 10th it's coming into England. So I kind of... I would, wouldn't I? But I think the King's court is quite...
I'm happier in the monastery. I think it's that And also, I suppose it's a very modern definition, isn't it, that we divide church and state. And in fact, there would have been extraordinary exchanges of personnel, of objects, of stories.
And the great assemblies and the great religious festivals and Pentecost and Easter and whatever, they're all together.
Yeah.
You know, those great documents from the early 10th century where the king is holding these huge assemblies. There's the earls, and including earls from the Dane law, the actual Danish lords from Orm, the serpent from Leicester, or somebody from wherever. And they're all, but with 17 bishops from all over, so they moved in the same circle. And the bishops went and fought in the battle line sometimes. So there's a crossover.
There's a definite crossover. And I mean, I'm always thinking about the physical environment of these things as well. And, when we think about Battle of Brunanburg, when we think about some of the other later poems that we get, and then we think about objects like the Bayeux Tapestry, which survives as an anomaly, but was possibly not an exception. The idea, I mean, I was working in a reconstructed Anglo-Saxon hall, the one in Kent, and you could have illustrations, you could have a sense that this is a performance that is like storytelling, that you're relating to objects, to items, to things that have happened. But Beowulf is different, isn't it? Because it verges on the fantastical. It is the fantastical imaginings of the human mind, isn't it? Which makes it different. Right, well, I mean, I know we could talk Beowulf all day. Just to sort of move from Beowulf to Du Fu, we have got here two of the fundamental sort of founding texts of identities, linguistic and national identities. Beowulf as this Old English epic, and we're going to move over to Du Fu as China's sort of primary poet. And then I know there's going to be a difference because, Michael, you're going to bring in some song towards the end. And we were just thinking there about performance. We were thinking about whether Beowulf might have been sung. And I think that's something we maybe need to hold as a distinction between the two. Because I agree with you, Heather, I think that the way the alliterative patternings worked, the way even working with kennings, that you have to think as you move two steps ahead. I think it's more like a thoughtful performance of a story. Whereas I think with Du Fu, we're going into the world of true, transportative, poetic composition. So let us move over from west to east.
Yeah, you're dealing with I mean, on one level, and this was sent to me by a friend in Chengdu. It's an AI or CG model of what Du Fu might have looked like. It's how the Chinese imagined him. We actually did a film about Du Fu with Sir Ian McKellen reading the poems with his purple stuff, and we were very worried about cultural appropriation, thinking the Chinese will be, although our Chinese co-producers loved the idea, we were worried about the audience, and the Chinese audience loved him, and they said, and he looks exactly like Du Fu. But the amazing thing is that you could be at exactly the same moment. Du Fu was born in 712 and died in 770. And that map that you had of the Woofingers and the court of the East Angles at Rendlesham, that could just be the period when an early version of Beowulf was composed. So you're at exactly the same moment. But of course, China is so much bigger, so much more ancient. You're dealing there with a culture. It's the oldest surviving poetic tradition in the world. The Book of Songs, the great anthology of love and war and everything else. The earliest poems are older than the Iliad and the Odyssey. So this is a poetic tradition of just so immensely bigger and older than ours that in some ways it barely bears talking about, although there are uncanny similarities. And Du Fu's one of their greatest, if not their greatest poet. Many scholars think he is, talking about the canon. The great American professor Stephen Owen said, the canon, we kind of, we don't think about these things, but you should think of Shakespeare and Dante and Du Fu. These are the great poets. So but his life is at an incredible moment in time. Tang Dynasty China is at its height. staggering achievements in art and music and painting and poetry. When they published a complete tongue poems in the early 1700s, they came up with 50,000 poems. And this is from the tongue, which are from about 600 to 900 AD. Publishing all those centuries later, 50,000 poems by 2,000 poets, about a tenth of whom were women. We're going to come back to the role of women in all this. And so it's an amazing, amazing moment. And Du Fu's born into that of a noble family and saw his path forward for advancement, and he was going to become a civil servant, and my portrait will be in the Great Hall with the best ministers. And he sits his exams, which of course he had to as a learned Chinese person. And he says, I was magnificent. I thought I was magnificent. I'd read everything. Nothing could possibly go wrong. And they failed him. And they not only failed him once, but they failed him twice. And there's been a long debate in China as to why somebody who was so brilliant could have been failed. But it was obvious that he was just a difficult person. It was difficult being Du Fu. And he wouldn't give them the answers that they wanted, you know. So he meanders then on a rather low-level bureaucratic job. Writing poems, ambitious to be a poet, one of many great poets at that, good poets at that time. But then China is struck by this devastating war of An Lushan in 755. It lasted 8 years. 30 million Chinese people disappear from the censuses from before the war to after the war. That's people who were either became refugees and were transplanted forever, died of famine or died of war. And he's caught up in that. And in the end, gives up any hope of working for the government and travels as a refugee. And even loses one of his children, dies of starvation when he's trying to, he's separated from the family, he gets home and the lamentation filled the house, my boy was dead. I'm ashamed of being a father, that I couldn't protect him. How could I have known that the harvest would fail, he says, but it did. And out of the war, a sensibility arises of incredible, the poems about war, suffering, the sufferings of the ordinary people. He keeps putting himself into the shoes of what it was like to be an ordinary person. At the end of the poem about the death of his boy, he says, and I'm one of the privileged. If I'm suffering like this, imagine what it was like for ordinary people. And in the book, I've compared him to it's the sense of the loss of ideals. And this is what struck me about what you were saying about Beowulf. The sense that you're looking at a time where the past is gone. And I compared him to the First World War poets, a distant analogy to help a Western audience, where the sense that the world was never going to be the same again after that summer of 1914, and the way Europe accelerated into horrors. And then in 1915 or 16, Freud wrote that book on mourning and melancholia when he spoke of how you can mourn as profoundly for an ideal of civilization as you can for a loved one. And in a way, that's what infuses some of Du Fu's greatest poetry. I'm going to read you a 4-line poem just to give you a tiny insight into his the war poetry. This is one of the most famous poems in Chinese. And the opening line, Guo Po Shan He Zai. 5 syllables. The state is destroyed, but the country remains. Guo Po Shan He Zai. The state is destroyed, but the country remains. In the city, and he's a prisoner working for the rebels as a slave laborer at this point, as they've occupied the capital, and the palace is boarded up, and everything's overgrown. In the city in the spring, grass and weeds grow everywhere. Grieving for the times, even the blossom sheds tears. The beacon fires have been burning for 3 months now. A letter from home. would be worth 10,000 in gold. Scratching my head, my white hair's getting thinner. Soon it won't even hold a hairpin. And it's a classic piece of Dufu where you get this kind of cosmic vision of disaster. And in the end, he's scratching his head, lamenting his own aging processes, you know. So that's the core of what transforms him from being a good poet to being a truly profound and great poet. And then the family go on this sort of terrifying journey to try to escape the war, through a horrendous winter over the mountains to escape to Sichuan. He gets some land from a friend and builds himself a thatched cottage and has moments of calm, but the war sweeps them up. And then he goes down into the Yangtze Gorges. And in the book, I've used photographs from the 19th century, which before the gorges were flooded by the Three Gorges Dam, to imagine the grandeur of the landscape in which he lived, and that sense of oneness with the cosmos that comes in some of his great poems from that period. You know, and he writes 400 of the surviving 1,400 poems are written in that period in the gorges. And maybe he tries in the end, with the news that the war is being rolled back, to escape back home. You can see the arc of his journey goes in this great arc around China, the heartland of China, the gorges at the bottom. But he dies on his boat, mentioning his dead son in his last poem, far from home in the winter of 770. And he died pretty much unknown. Many people recognized he was a great poet. He wrote lovely occasional poems for people that they saved. But it's only after his death that his sons published a small manuscript, of course. Printing was not yet there in China. A book of his stuff. And then in the next dynasty, under the Song, they recognize his true greatness, and huge printed editions of most of the poems come out. And from then on, he's on this track to being the poet who most expresses the values, if you like, of what it is to be Chinese. And through thick and thin, the Chinese are stuck with him. I can remember talking to ordinary Chinese folk at the thatched cottage, which is now a museum in Chengdu, and an old gentleman saying, the thing is, I come here every month. It's a form of meditation, he says, to sit where Dufu wrote his poetry in this beautiful setting. And you know, he never lost his sense of the common people. And that's why we love him so much. So that, in a nutshell, is the story. And I would only add to that, you can, it's a difficult character, and he's a hypochondriac at times, and he drinks too much and tells you that he's drinking too much, and I've got to stop, and he's quirky, but there's something very lovable about him, I think, and yeah, very interesting character. And of course, he's a great supporter of the idea of a just state. And he's still, of course, at the center of teaching in the schools. Everybody learns his poems when they're at school in China, in secondary school. And he's promoted as being a patriot and all that. But of course, his thing was it had to be a just state. And his poetry of critiquing unjust government is truly great. So, as always with the poets have this ambiguous relation to power. Is that enough?
That's amazing.
Okay.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I think the thing that strikes me so profoundly when I read you recording Dufu's travels, the landscape, is the incredible civilization that is thriving in that golden age. That it does sort of put what's happening in the West in the shadows completely. These courts, I mean, you even mentioned the fact that he has to sit this civil servants exam. I mean, that sounds positively modern. You know, there's such a complicated civil service that you have to sit the exam, pass it, and otherwise you'd have to be a small bureaucrat. I mean, it's staggering. And then, you know, you include in the book suggestions about the wealth, the richness of the court. You've got the poet, the artist, musician, and then women in that court too. So there's a line of women as fair as goddesses. I mean, for you, Michael, who've spent so long working on the Western early medieval period, how do you reconcile these two worlds? Because they seem like literally worlds apart, don't they?
Yeah, they are worlds apart. But history moves at different paces, doesn't it? And probably if you were in the court in Constantinople at that time, and you'd gone as an ambassador to Tang China, you would have felt very much at home.
Of course.
It was more sophisticated in some ways, but or even in Fatimid Cairo or somewhere like that. But out in the West, it was different because our culture was being rebuilt not from the bottom, but what we call the West, I always think, is the barbarian tribes who settled after Rome and whose language you've just spoken for us, Heather. They're creating new societies.
Yeah.
And the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th, 9th century is the first real flowering. And then the 12th century Renaissance, Peter Abelard and John Salisbury, and then the Italian Renaissance are the stages by which the culture was recovered. Still drawing on the classical past, but essentially the culture that came in Western Europe in the Dark Ages was classical past was a memory rather than a.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I get all bristly about people calling it a dark age, because in a way, I mean, we know this, but Heather, I'm sure you'll agree as well that it's a entirely different worldview from the very ground up, isn't it?
Yes.
And you know, the world of Beowulf, the world of the Old Norse legends and myths and sagas, there's a different relationship with nature. There's a different relationship with interiors, exteriors, cities. You know, they're just they're not comparable, are they, in many ways?
I suppose I'm not quite sure when the world of Beowulf would be. I mean, if you don't know whether a poem belongs to 700 or 1016, for instance, it's like not knowing whether a poem was written by Shakespeare or Seamus Heaney. I mean, you just can't. What can you do? What can you do? But I think one of the surprising things about Beowulf is somehow that synthesis of Christian sophisticated scholarship. I mean, it was new to the Anglo-Saxons, of course. But it was a kind of a thought, a whole system of immense sophistication and the scholarship and the church fathers and all that stuff, and trying to in Beowulf melding that into a poem which also includes Norse mythology. I mean, Norse mythology is an extraordinary world apart. I mean, couldn't be more different from Christianity. I mean, the great god of Norse tradition was Odin, of course, who'd given one eye in exchange for wisdom, so that was kind of something. But I mean, he was a shapeshifter. He was a cross-dresser. He was definitely queer in the sense that it was difficult to pin down his sexuality. He was an oath breaker. He instigated violence. He had a whole series of names. Bölverker, which means a bale worker, someone who ferments dissent. I mean, what kind of a god was that? And one of the interesting things about Beowulf is that there's no mention anywhere no direct mention of anything to do with the New Testament.
Yes.
Because the New Testament was just so different from all that Scandinavian stuff. So there are no apostles, there's no Christ, there's no Redeemer, there's no Savior, there's no Blessed Virgin, there's none of that. There are just a couple of strange references. One reference says that when Beowulf goes to tackle Grendel's mother in some kind of mysterious dry bit at the bottom of this bottomless pool, he fights with Grendel's mother, and he surprisingly, after looking that he's not going to win, he wins the fight. He kills Grendel, and her innards float to the top of the pond. And it was at nones, right? The monastic, the 9th hour of the day, and Beowulf's men think that that must be Beowulf's remains, from the gore floating to the surface. The Danes are sure of it and go home, but the Beowulf's men wished but did not expect. There's a bit of the kind of thoughtfulness that Nina was talking about. They wished that they might see their Lord again, but they didn't expect to. So they're in a sort of despair. Now, in the New Testament, of course, it was in the 9th hour of the day when Christ suddenly himself lost faith. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? That was at the 9th hour of the day. So there's the poet. Just that's a bleak New Testament reference, but so carefully done. The moment when Beowulf's supporters, these Yeats, whoever they were, when they despair, is the time when the kind of the archetypal site of despair, the time of despair. Yeah. But that's pretty well all. There's no kind of New Testament ethic really. It's the Old Testament that somehow is brought to chime with the Norse material.
Yeah, and I think, this ties, what you said right at the beginning, Michael, about just the sheer scale of China and just the sheer sense of sophistication that the Tang Dynasty particularly has achieved in those 6th to 8th centuries. It's such a contrast if we look west, because of course, with the collapse of Rome, you've got just so much variety in terms of native people, disenfranchised people in many ways, claiming back identity and space after having been part of this Roman Empire. But the variety in languages, the variety in religious beliefs, in practices, in artistic behaviours, in just self-expression. And it is so interesting when you then layer Christianity on top of that, how much creativity it leads to. So we could sort of see Beowulf come out of that world. And in contrast, Du Fu, there's a elegance that's coming out of a formal tradition that simply isn't existing in the West in that way yet. Because you say in your book, Michael, that Du Fu has mastered not just one poetic technique, he's able to turn his hand to all of them, that there's this established system that's been running for so long already that he can play around with different techniques and different types of poetry. So he's coming out of a different world in that respect.
A very different world, I think. The sinologist Arthur Graham, who did some very distinguished books on Chinese philosophy, but also did some wonderful little book on Chinese poetry, argued that cultures move at different times, and he felt that there's a change in cultures in poetry, where poetry suddenly becomes self-reflexive and able to express much more than it did in its more primitive or epic or whatever predecessors, and that suddenly the literature, I can't quite express it, but the self-reflexive element of it becomes really, powerful. And he said, for instance, that really happens in English literature in the 16th century. In French, he thought not until the 18th century, I'm amazed. But in China, in the late 8th, you know.
Amazing.
So
this sort of internalization and sense of self-awareness. I mean, we see glimmers of it in Beowulf, don't we? There's definitely references to the poetic creation of poetry.
you can say what you want to say, I suppose. And,
But this idea that it's about the inner self in Dufu, that it's about the personal sort of diving into the self, is different, isn't it?
Yeah, the inner self is crucial. For an 8th century person, he's giving you an amazing insight into what it felt like to be an 8th century person.
Absolutely,
This is what I felt like. This is what there are even poems about kind of cooking noodles, planting stuff in your garden, or his beloved horse that had been with him for so long through their terrible adventures. You've been such a faithful servant to me, and you've been so patient. And I'm going to write a poem about you. So it's a very
different.
There's no sense of the first person in Beowulf at all.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think the poet actually externalizes an inner self by creating all these fictional poets, whether it's Beowulf recalling his childhood, or whether it's a court poet telling his fictional Danes a story about their past. Or there are a kind, as I said, it's kind of kaleidoscope of poetic figures. But they're all externalized. They're all our Beowulf poet presenting different kinds of poet and different kinds of poetry, but externalizing them. It's completely different. It's
a different also, do you think, between Latin and the vernacular, that when you look at Carolingian poetry, say you look at the poetry of Alcuin, you mentioned Alcuin, the Yorkshireman who became the head of Charlemagne's court school. And he wrote absolutely beautiful poetry in Latin.
He did. And they're very personal and intimate.
Some of them are very, very personal, expressing deep affection for his male friends, and and beautiful nature poetry, poem about the nightingale and whatever.
But then think in the vernacular, you have the elegies, you have Wolf and Aardvakker. I mean, that intimacy.
Or the wife's lament, as people call it.
And so I think I think the other thing is that we now, in the modern world, completely appreciate the difference in genres. And we can go to a bookshop and pick out a fantasy book, or pick out a history or an epic, pick out something that's a philosophical, reflective book. And we sometimes forget that incredible diversity of themes and approaches has always been there. And I think by comparing the works of Dufu and Beowulf, we're looking at two extremes in terms of genre as well. They are distinct works.
Well, yes.
And I think it's just so exciting because, when I tell people I'm an early medievalist, they're like, oh, it's all just mud huts and sort of Monty Python piling piles of mud up in a field. But it's not. To show the richness and complexity and through the poetry, I think is such an insightful aspect. I'm aware that we are going to run out of time. And what I must say as well, while I have a moment, we are live, and we would like to take questions from you if you're online. Please, we're lovely people, we're not scary. Send us questions and I will go through them on the iPad in a minute. We will also leave time for questions in the room soon. But before we turn to the questions in the room, women! We haven't talked about the women. And I know, Michael, that you have a clip that we're going to hear, hopefully, which is... explain what it is.
Well, it's only a minute long, and it was simply sent to me by a lady who I'm in contact with, who lives in the countryside near Changsha. And this is about the oral singing tradition of Chinese poetry, which still survives and is now undergoing a renaissance, if you like, all over China. And why it's so interesting is that I'm about to start in the new year a film about China's greatest woman poet, Li Qingzhao, who could be argued as the most consequential woman poet anywhere because of her profound influence not only on Chinese and Eastern literature, but the amazing focus of interest on her life today. She lived from the 1080s to about 1150. I've now got in touch with women's groups who are I discover her singing her poetry and passing it down. The lady you're going to hear, the passing down is 190 years in her family from a person outside the family who taught a member of her family. But it's only a little thing. I just thought you might be interested. And this is a very famous, it's a 4-line poem. And Du Fu's on his uppers, he's reached the deep south, the land south of the Yangtze, and he's cadging money and cadging accommodation from people. And then he meets an old musician, the most famous musician of his youth, 40-odd years before, a voice like a demon, Li Guinyan had, who is also a refugee. Now, even the great artists and performers are all refugees from war. And the poem simply says, is called On Meeting Li Guinyan Again Down in the South. And the poem says this: I often saw you in Prince Chi's house, and I heard you a number of times in the hall of Lord Sui. It's true, the scenery south of the river is very beautiful. And here in the season of fallen blossoms, we meet again. And of course, the season of fallen blossoms is the whole, everything is fallen. They're both men who are going to die soon, and it's a terribly poignant little thing, and everything is unspoken. And this is the one poem that in all secondary schools in China you will learn. And then, to my amazement, I discovered that there is this parallel tradition of singing it, and I thought you might like to hear it. So may we hear the little sound clip, please?
既往者累，紧张间，翠酒当前，几斗闻。正是江南好风景，落花时节有风君。正是江南好风景，落花时节有风君。
There it is.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Isn't that beautiful?
And the staggering thing is, because the poets, of course, since the Song dynasty, have been available in printed texts, woodblock printed texts for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
But Du Fu was just on the century before that, miraculously survived in manuscript. But the parallel tradition of singing is very interesting, and I've often thought about that recently, because the more you read, the more you realize that before the age of print, poetry was essentially a performing tradition. You read Horace talking about singing his poems to the Emperor Augustus, and wherever you look, there's evidence of the oral performance of poetry in some form or other.
And it's one of the tragedies of survival as well. I mean, while we can retain artifacts, while we can sometimes retain manuscripts and texts, that immense body of music is so hard to grasp. And to think about the relationship between sound and performance is something that may remain out of our grasp, because it's the intangible, it's the the ethereal, it's gone. But what a beautiful, beautiful recording, and also powerful to make us think about women. What we have had today on a day about relating to the British Library's Medieval Women exhibition, we've actually ended up talking about very male topics. But in as much as I think that these individuals, the Beowulf poet, the characters within the poem, and Du Fu and the world of which Du Fu is a part, we can put flesh on the societies of which the women we see reflected in that exhibition are a part. I often think it's important not to be too binary, to only focus in on women or men or the distinction between them. I think the job of historians and the job of what we all try to do is world build and immerse and create an understanding of a society that is long gone and out of reach. And I think you'll both agree with me that Heather and Michael have been the most extraordinary world builders for us tonight. Let's give them a round of applause. Okay, we've got just 10 minutes for some questions. Also, we will all be signing books afterwards, so Christmas is coming, just don't. So do please join us afterwards for that. Now, I have some questions here. I might just start with one from the iPad, and then we'll blow out to see if anybody in the audience gives you a minute longer to think about something. Okay, so this is an interesting question for both of you. Please may I ask if trading links at the time would have enabled cross-cultural poetic communications? Isn't that an excellent question? Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Do you know cross-cultural poetic connections are really, really interesting in history, aren't they? And one of the most things that's fascinated me recently is the whole question of the origins of the Homeric poem.
Absolutely.
And the influence of the Near Eastern poetry and the translation from Akkadian into Hurrian, into Hittite, into, where the exact poem is not transmitted, but the stories are recycled in different ways. I think that is really interesting. And in a sense, maybe the Beowulf story is the map that you showed at the beginning with the Jutland and Norway and Sweden and England, that there is a circulation of stories.
Absolutely.
And people like Hrothgar go back, well, a long way.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Silk Roads exhibition in the British Museum, I haven't seen it yet, but apparently there's a Buddha.
Yep.
Which was found.
It's in Sweden. It's gone out my head.
Somewhere in Sweden.
Helgo. Is it Helgo? No, it's not Helgo.
I can't remember.
Someone in the room will remember.
But I mean, there's this...
It is Helgo. Yeah. Little jade Buddha. Yeah.
I mean, I mean, Beowulf, the poet of Beowulf, tells us that when Hrothgar built this magnificent hall, Heorot, he brought craftsmen from all over the known world.
Absolutely.
I mean, what in this extraordinary reach, really? I mean, whether that's it's not true, but the reach of it. And then archaeologists have found that this is true. My husband and I were in the Isle of Skye on a very wet day about 2 months ago, and we were at the site of a Viking hoard where there were dirhams, Arabic coins from Uzbekistan, and there they were, kind of found on the Isle of Skye.
Absolutely.
The stretch of trade is absolutely astonishing in the early Middle Ages.
Well, I think we see it really vividly in some of the Viking finds. So in Feminine, I write about the Burka warrior woman, but just the idea that she may have even come from the steppes, and that the clothes she was wearing, silks. I mean, if you've got silks in tapestries and embroideries that are being found in the West, that suggests transmission along the Silk Road. So art and archaeology are also a gateway for understanding what poetics might have gone through as well. There's no doubt. I mean, if you've got a Buddha turning up in a burial in Scandinavia, what did that mean to them? Why are they being buried with it? Have they actually sat down and had a chat with someone about Buddhism? And so we will never know. But of course,
they must have said, "Who is this?
Who is this? And what's their story? And what do they mean?
Why are his hands like that?"
Absolutely. And I mean, even earlier, Heather, you were talking about this wonderful transition between the Viking world of Odin and Thor and Freya, and then the transmission to Christianity of the Anglo-Saxons. We see it, don't we, with things like the resurrection being shown as the winged flying machine of Wayland the Smith. And we see the crucifix being interpreted as Odin hanging on the tree of knowledge. So this idea of transmission, we see it in art, we see the evidence for it. So in relation to that question, I think it has to have happened in poetics.
Oh, yes, I'm sure.
It has to have. What a wonderful question.
Great question.
Brilliant. So do we have a question in the room? Anyone want to put their hands up? We're very nice, we don't bite. I've also got to open this up because there was another question on here that I wanted to ask. Okay, this is a really good one. I would love to know what each speaker thinks their authors would have made of the others' work.
Oh, yes.
If we can imagine a world where they could have read each other's contemporary work. What a great question.
It is a great question, isn't it?
What do you think Du Fu would have made of Beowulf?
Well, actually, I think you probably would have thought it was very uncouth.
Wouldn't he?
And didn't obey the rules of poetics.
Yes.
But actually, in terms of context, you see, it was such an international civilization in Tang China.
Yeah.
And where the Silk Route is opening to the west, they know about Byzantium, they know about Japan, and you can. And even in his poems, you meet Iranian cake sellers on the road to Loyang, or the kind of, they definitely, you met pretty much the people from the whole of Eurasia in the markets of China. So he wouldn't have been surprised, perhaps.
But you might have thought it was a bit bawdy, a bit uncourtly. And what do you think the Beowulf poet would have made of Du Fu's poem?
I think he might have thought, why is this poet telling us this? Why is he telling us about what he ate?
This is not heroic at all.
It's not heroic. It doesn't stand for anything else. He would have thought it's just
self-obsession.
I think he would have thought that. Yeah.
I think you're right. And I think there would have been points of overlap. I mean, within the courts that Du Fu was around the periphery of, there would have been epic and heroic and courtly kind of
but they would have
pronouncements.
absolutely stood together on war.
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, the poet of Beowulf is not glorifying war.
No way.
Anyway, it's all happening again, and it keeps on happening. And it happened in the old stories. I'm telling you, it's going to happen to the Danes.
Absolutely.
It's happening now. When I read your marvelous book, The Footsteps of Du Fu, I was thinking about Du Fu's kind of sense of the state and of war. They would have been absolutely at one on that.
I mean, that lament of the last survivor, the passages that are just so incredibly sad and moving, and yet both, like the whole of Beowulf in many ways, but both sort of telescoping out of time and being very much a part of that warrior elite.
Yes.
And I think that aspect would resonate with both, I think, in the same way. If the Beowulf poet was reading Du Fu, they would know their elegies, they would know these sorts of laments and these tragic reflections on the human condition. And so I think they would definitely share that too. So perhaps they wouldn't be too unfamiliar with each other.
Certain Chinese poems in Old English would be really great. Funnily enough, I mean, when you think of Ezra Pound's Cathay, Ezra Pound published the book of poems called Cathay in 1915. And there had been translations of Tang poetry before in the 19th century, but they were rather sentimentalizing and, chrysanthemums and candles dripping and all that. And suddenly, here were poems actually mainly based on the Li Bai, the contemporary poems about the wars, about war. And he, in the slim little book, he translates some Anglo-Saxon poetry as well. And he puts the two of them together. And actually, I was at that lovely little museum in Kettle's Yard in Cambridge recently, and by some strange circumstance, the guy who founded Kettle's Yard got the surviving stuff from the French sculptor Gaudier-Bresca, who was killed in his late 20s on the Battle of the Marne in 1915. And there's a letter of Gaudier-Bresca to Pound saying, "We've read your poem, these Chinese poems about war on the front, and I and my colleagues, and they're sitting there in the trenches, think nothing has more profoundly portrayed our situation in these poems, and so there's eerie connections.
Isn't that eerie?
Yeah.
And in fact, that is the perfect glue with which to tie all this together, because obviously, you know, we could talk about legacy, we could talk about the impact of all the people that you mentioned in your works, Heather, you know, going through to Auden, going through to Heaney, going through to Tolkien, but again, you know, the same in relation to Do Fu, that unbroken influence down the centuries on future poets and creators, but this sense that you know, the profound truth of poetry that still holds is to sort of search for those things that tie us across time and space. And the idea that their despair at war, and then that shared feeling with the World War I war poets that you mentioned right the way at the top there, Michael, I think it teaches us to value poetry fresh again, and to see how perennial, how powerful it can be. And I think that's a wonderful place to leave this amazing discussion. Thank you so much, Heather. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
I'm just sneaking in to also say a huge thank you to Nina for chairing that event so brilliantly. Your book is also on sale, so thank you to Nina as well.
Thank you.